Hey, welcome to the video. Today's video is about resizing automatically the text within a label when the label resizes. So this is the 5th video in a series of 6 about tips and tricks and lessons learned around our backup app that we built for our customers. I'll show you how we apply that in our backup app, but in this video we will build a small app that has 2 labels and where you can see that one does resize and the other one does not. Check it out.
So in our backup app, we have this main start screen with a bunch of buttons and some text. The text on the buttons is not set to resize, but the text in the labels in light blue, if you like, they will resize. So for example, if I make the screen bigger, you'll see that this doesn't change, but the font size of everything else changes so that it fits the screen. Also, if you make it smaller, the font size will adjust, and even if you make it just smaller in one direction, the font size will adjust. So this just makes it easier for people to adjust the app to the size that they like, and they will still be able to read all the text. So how do we build that? Let's have a look. So I've created this small app to recreate the behavior of the backup app we just showed you. It's a screen with 2 labels. The black label has text in it that will not resize, and the gray label has text that will resize and actually has already resized, because as we will see in the code, the font size of both pieces of text was set to 50. This is 50, this is not 50, because 50 doesn't fit in the label, and the text is therefore automatically adjusted, or the font size is adjusted automatically. Now, if we change the size of the screen and therefore the labels, what's going to happen? You can see that the text here adjusts to the size of the label, whereas this text has now become too large because the font size of 50 has not been reduced. So that's what we'll build. To build our little app, I've already set up the structure. So this is my usual Kivy structure. There's only going to be one screen. So main screen inherits from screen. I then have my app, which inherits from app with its build function, which returns the load file to my GUI resize, which is what you are seeing on the right hand side. And then here, this is the instance of my app, of which I then run the run method. Okay, that's simple enough. On the Kivy side, we just have one main screen. It's a box layout with the first label where the text will not resize, and a second label where I do want the text to resize. So I've given it a gray background just to distinguish it from the other one. And then there's a text here that says text will adjust to fit the label initially and when resized. So I've deliberately chosen a long text because the text will adjust to fit the label initially, because as we saw, the text was fitted to the label when we opened up the app immediately, and then when we resized the app, it was adjusted again. And as you can see here, let me move back to the left, the font size for both labels was the same, but because this text was too long, it was already adjusted. So how do we do that? Well, you need some code for that. And to do that, I'm going to actually create a separate label class such that I can put my code in there. So I'm going to call it resizable label. And when I do that, I will need a class here called resizable label. And that will inherit from label. Okay, so I'm going to write a function, and then I'm going to call that function twice. Once when the label is initiated, if you like, so to fit the label initially, and then again once the label is resized. So those are 2 different events that will call the same function. Okay, so what is this function? Well, let's call this function adjust label size, or font size even, because we're actually not changing the label size, we're changing the font size. So the first thing to do is to just take the font size from the label as it is. And then we're going to see if this font size is too large, then we'll reduce it. If it's not large enough, we'll increase it. So that's the logic. So the first thing to do is take the font size from the label. Now to do the resizing, I'm going to create 2 loops. The first loop is to reduce the font size, and the second one will be to increase the font size Okay, so those will be two loops. I'm going to use while loops, and I'm going to use infinite loops, and then include a break clause when the text fits. So the first one, to reduce the font size, the first thing to do is to create an object that represents a markup label. Why a markup label? Because we will be using a refresh method which applies to markup label. And we import markup label from Kivy core text markup. Okay, so markup label, and you need to give that label some properties. So the font name, well, we'll just take whatever the font name is of the current label. We're not going to change that because all we want to change is the font size. So I'll take the font name. Let me make that a little bit wider because we're not actually going to use much of the Kivy file. Then the font size, and this is crucial, is not self.font size, because font size is a variable that we will be changing throughout the looping process. So we will continuously change the font size until it fits. So this will be font size. And then the text is just the text that the label's showing, so we're not changing that. The next step is to call the refresh method to make sure the label's up to date. Right, so the font size has been adjusted and we are ready to start checking our sizes. So we're going to check how much available height and available width that we have. That is the height that I have, so self, that's the height. But I'm going to take off some padding because sometimes people include padding. So the padding, now which one? Well, I'm looking at the height, so I'm taking off twice padding Y. Now, why do I take it off twice? Well, because padding happens on both sides of the label. So you want to make sure you count that. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the width. And then I'll take off twice the padding. But of course, in this case, it's padding X. So now I know how much room I've got to play with. So now I'll do some checking. So I'm going to check if my font size is too large. If that is the case, I'm going to adjust it. So the first thing to do, if my font size, if that's larger than my available height, so then I will set the font size to be equal to the available height. Okay. So it was too large. Now we make it smaller to fit the available height. That's straightforward enough. Now, the other thing to look for is the content width of the label. So if the content width is larger than the available width, or if the content height, if that is larger than the available height, well, then we're going to reduce our font size because then our font is too large. And so I'll take the font size and I'll just reduce it to 95% of its height. Now this here is, you might be familiar with the plus equals. So this is the same thing as saying, okay, now else break. Now this is an important piece because what happens is, because this is a continuous loop, this will keep looping, right? So it will check what the available height and width is. Then if the font size is too large for the available height, it will adjust the font size to fit the available height. Great, but that might still mean that it's too wide, right? We've only looked at the height, and it will keep looping, so it will loop again. In the second iteration, this will no longer be true because we've already adjusted the height. So then the second check is done. So the width, if the content width is larger than the available width, or if the content height is larger than the available height, then we just reduce the font size. And this will keep going as long as one of these two statements is true. Now, if none of these are true, it will be the else leg. But if none of these are true, that means the font size isn't too large and the width isn't too large, and therefore it fits. Okay, so we've started from a font that was too large, we've reduced it, more factor 5% if you like, until the conditions were no longer true, and therefore the font fits. So that is the logic. We're going to apply similar logic for, well, if we need to increase the font size. So again, a loop. So again, we need a markup label, and we need to refresh that label. Now the check is going to be slightly different. So we're going to check the content width, and normally, let's write down what you would normally think. So you're going to compare that to the available width, okay? And I'm also going to compare the height to the available height, And now I'm saying, well, if that is the case, so then I want to increase the size. So in this case, I want to increase the font size. So I'm going to use a factor of 1.05. Okay. Now this won't work. Well, let me finish the clause first. So else I'll break. So the same logic here. So the loop will keep looping until this statement is no longer true, in which case the text will fit, and we can break out of the loop. Now this isn't going to work, or it can break, because what we are doing is we are increasing the font size by 5%. Okay, but our condition is that the content width is smaller than available height, but it can be smaller by less than 5%. It could be 99.99999%. In which case, if you then increase it by 5% or times 1.05, your content width will then be too wide. Okay, so then it won't fit the label anymore. So what you're going to need to do is you need to say, well, if it's smaller than label height, but by enough of a margin such that when I increase it by 5%, it's still within there, then increase it. Okay, now the way to do that is you just check whether the label, the content width, if you increase it by 10%, if that is still within the available height. And this, of course, needs to be the width. So if the content width increased by 10%, if that's still within the width, then by all means do increase it by 5%. And the same thing for the label, for the available height. And this needs to be content. So if the label's content height, but increased by 10%, so if it's quite a bit smaller than the available height, then by all means go ahead and increase it by 5%. So that's the logic. Now the other thing we need to do is now we need to actually assign this font size variable that we've been changing. So font size here and font size there. We now need to assign that to the instance. So self dot font size equals font size. So there you go. That is our function, adjust font size. Now there's a few more things we need to do. Firstly, for this label, we need to set its markup value to true, because we're using the fact that it's a markup label. So let's set that to true. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to tell the label during which events it needs to trigger this function. So the events are, well, when initially the text goes into the label, and then secondly, when we resize the label. So the first event is called onText. Then what we want to do, well, we just want to call this function. And then we're going to want to do the same thing for the second event, which is called onSize. Pull through the args and the quags, and then the function. So there you go. We've set the markup to true. On these two events, when these events are triggered, the font size should adjust as per this function here. Okay, let's give that a go. So this is our app. The text should not resize here. You can see the text has already adjusted, okay, because this is font size 50. This is no longer font size 50. It was adjusted. And if I now adjust my label, you'll see that this text is now too large, and this text now fits the box. So that's how you do that. I hope you found that helpful, or at least interesting. If you did, please like the video, leave a comment, or even consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks very much. See you soon. Bye.